Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and what follows is an excerpted clip from one of my longer webinars. So what I've decided is that sometimes when people ask really interesting questions, I will pull out that particular part of a webinar and make it available to you as a short clip so that if you don't have time to watch a 1-hour webinar, you can at least watch and listen to the brief exchanges that I usually have with people who attend my webinars. So here is one such clip from a recent webinar. I hope you enjoy it. But for our purposes, I think if we understand what do we mean when we say postmodern, and then if we understand what do we mean post-colonial and bring them together in conversation, then it's better for us to understand. Now, of course, if you are curious about post-colonialism and what are different ways of thinking it, imagining it, and practicing it, this is, of course, the course that we are running. This is the 8th session, so I do strongly recommend that you should watch the previous videos, but also my general lectures on post-colonialism should be useful too. So we already know that post-colonialism, in one way or the other, always deals with issues of the colonial experience, the contact phase, the post-colonial phase. And while colonialism isn't considered the originary moment of these cultures, it is considered an experience that has had huge impact on the post-colonial societies. And so most of the times the authors, the writers, the poets are either talking about the contact phase or about the struggles of liberation or about the impact that the colonization left on their cultures. All of this comes under post-colonial, but there is no single answer to what constitutes post-colonial. And anytime someone does that, they're reducing it to what they want to believe in the course to be the post-colonial. And there are, of course, quite a few critiques of it, which we have discussed. But by and large, what we can agree on that most of the time, the post-colonial text, whether written by people living in the post-colonies or in diaspora, deal with issues of immigration, marginality, identity, right? Colonial culture and its implications for the native cultures, then within the post-colonies, what's happening to women, what's happening to minorities. All of those issues form part of post-colonial studies. And so knowing post-colonialism in that complexity is important. Now, postmodernism similarly is a highly contested term, right? I have a couple of lectures on postmodernism, especially on Linda Hutchins' book, which I highly recommend. But by and large, what we do understand about postmodernism is that the post in postmodern doesn't necessarily mean that modernism has ended, right? Postmodernism doesn't have an episteme of its own. But there are certain things that happen in postmodernism. For example, the distinction of high and low literature is kind of abolished. What was previously considered popular literature becomes equally accessible and respectable within postmodernism. Then there is a lot of playfulness in postmodernist texts. They also play with issues of history, sometimes in a parody, which makes fun of history, sometimes in a kind of pastiche, which is respectful of history and rewrites it. Most postmodern texts are also self-reflexive. What that means is that they point to their own construction as you are reading the novel. Sometimes a novelist will say, here is a novel, you are reading it, the novelist would address you. So all of these things coming together then form postmodernism as something that tweaks what was available in modernism, what modernism did, and then disrupts that. One important aspect of postmodernity, of course, is that there is no single narrative that we can rely on. So just as the narratives in the culture are usually built by the dominant groups, right, and then offered to us as the norm, as natural, that's exactly sort of what happens in modernism. But in postmodernism, there is kind of a multivocal literary production because the minorities are writing, because the women are writing, because other people who were previously excluded are also adding their voices to it. In terms of genre, since the distinction between high and low culture has been eliminated, so what would previously be considered bad literature, right, because it wasn't high enough, is equally as worthy of our respect and people study it. So comic books, right, videos, cartoons, they become worthy of our study. So all of these things coming together then constitute kind of a sense of the postmodern. Now, of course, the most important book is Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, right? But do keep in mind that Lyotard later repudiated that work. He basically said that this is the most terrible book I've ever written. But one of the main ideas that we get from Lyotard is this idea that society can no longer sustain grand narratives upon which different cultures were built, grand narratives of religion, grand narratives of rationality, reason, identity, and they are now being replaced by petite narratives, the smaller narratives. And keeping that in mind is crucial in understanding postmodernism. Okay, so if we roughly have an idea of what we understand by postcolonialism, not a very strictly constituted term, and postmodernism as a diffuse term with varied connotations, but some similarities within the studies of postmodernism as well. Then what we are dealing with is when we bring the two together, we are bringing two deeply complex and indeterminate terms together. And so the result would be complex and nuanced and not really stable. As we cannot actually assume what exactly is post-colonialism. No one can tell you, oh, here, this is what post-colonialism is, right? So when we look at the intersectionality of the two, then we have to look at, first of all, the works of post-colonial authors, loosely brought together. The reason I contest this idea of grand narratives dying and being replaced by relativistic, maybe petite narratives, is that in the post-colonies, actually, it's a reversal of that. Wherever you go in the post-colonies, there is a reprisal of religious ways of looking at life, which of course offers a universalistic view of the world, of the hereafter. There is a constant reactionary response here to postmodernism, and that is the reliance increasingly on religious doctrines, religious texts, on pushing against the egalitarian maybe or democratic or multifarious push of postmodernism and retrieving back into orthodoxies, theological views of the world. So there is an increase in the world on reliance on grand narratives, maybe as a reaction to the extremes of postmodernism. That's my reading of it, and you can correct me on that. That is why when in the late 1990s, when I was preparing for my master's exams, when I went looking for books in a local bookstore on postmodernism, the first books that were actually written by pastors, by evangelical Christians, because they posit postmodernism as this godless world in which there are no morals and nothing else, right? And they were writing against it. So anytime someone writes anything against an idea, post-colonialism and postmodernism, do keep in mind that they make it into something that they can attack. It's a straw man argument usually. So similarly, if you go to Pakistan, right, what to talk of postmodernism, we are still trying to defend modernism. So the religious people will basically make the West into this something where anything goes, right? And against that, they will juxtapose their own so-called pure, you know, humanity or their own solution to world's problems. If you go to India, there is a lot of focus on dharma these days from the right-wing Hindus who are absolutely not just offering that Hinduism is a greater way of life, but who are saying that this is the only way of life. So in a way, then the reactionary responses to the democratization of the public sphere are actually stronger at this time. Now, what Baba discusses in his chapter is not the peripheral nature of post-colonial work in terms of postmodernism, but its very centrality, right? How does he argue that? What he's talking about initially, and this is a very complex debate that I'm just simplifying, maybe at the cost of the original work. What he talks about is that the original explanations of postmodernism are pretty Eurocentric, right? But look at what happens in postmodernism. The issues of cultural difference become huge. The extra voices that are being added to the narrative of modernism, where are they coming from? From women, right? From people with different sexualities, but also from the migrants and immigrants. These are the people who are articulating a new mode of representation and thinking, which is neither where they came from, nor fully assimilated in the dominant culture. So what emerges out of that is an indeterminate way of looking at metropolitan cultures and kind of a hybrid way of representing truth or reality. So I think what he's doing is he's making the post-colonial cultural production central to the project of postmodernism. And that is crucial to keep in mind, right? If you ever read anything about postmodernism, one thing you already know is that this idea of periphery and the center, I mean, if you look at it mathematically, the center cannot exist without the periphery. The only reason we know the center of a circle is because we imagine a periphery. That means that the periphery determines the center, right? Yeah, the term in postmodernism is constitutive otherness, right? That myself as it is constituted by my other, right? You have to go to Saussurean linguistics for that. If you look at postmodernist production from the post-colonial authors, you will see that mostly it's the diasporic authors who are actually, in a way, delving more into postmodernism. I mean, the greatest example, of course, is Salman Rushdie. When you read Midnight's Children, right, the way the narrative is broken, the way history is sometimes satirically retold, the way the historical characters sometimes emerge in the novel, all of those are postmodernist tropes, right? And you see them. But not all post-colonial novels are postmodernists. I mean, there are novels that are pretty stable. They tell a realistic stories. So if you look at the postmodern canon, a post-colonial canon, if you pick up Ngugi Thiong'o, read The Devil on the Cross, it's a realistic leftist novel. You pick up Bushi Emechita's Joys of Motherhood, another realistic political novel, right? God of Small Things, Arundhati Roy, right? Maybe modernist, right? Maybe limit modernist text. Depending on quite a lot of novels being written by Pakistani authors, Mohsin Hamid and others, are mostly modernist novels, other than Exit West, which becomes slightly postmodernist, right? But then when we go to post-colonialism, we find out that there is a range of temporalities and range of forms and genres. Some post-colonial authors are writing in the postmodern sense, the novels that they write are short stories. Some of them are still writing realistic novels. Some of them are still writing modernist novels. It doesn't matter. We cannot think, oh, they are behind, right? No. It's a question of choice. What kind of a novel would you write? It doesn't mean that somehow there is a monolithic thing called the post-colonial novel, and somehow it can be postmodern. And then, what kind of a postmodernism is it? Is it the postmodernism as defined by people over here, right? Or are there postmodernisms peculiar to different postcolonial nation states or cultures or regions? Baba would say that postcolonialism is not national because it is transnational. And similarly, postmodernism cannot really be restrained into, even if you're telling the story of an immigrant community from Nigeria, from Kenya, in New York, you are telling a global story which is consumed globally, shared globally, and has implications for a global, world, right? So, so, so in that sense, the post-colonial writer living in the metropolitan, writing their fiction, is writing about a nation past or present, but in that sense is creating a new future which can be shared in planetary terms. Thank you so much for watching or listening to this brief clip. If you are interested in the longer version, the link will be in the description and you can watch the whole webinar. Thank you so much for your support. And as always, if you have any questions, any concerns, you can always post them in the comments and I'll be happy to respond to them. If you have a moment and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do so now so that you get timely notifications of whatever is happening on this channel. Thank you for your support. Stay safe, and as always, from me to you, peace and love.